My name is Nick Hool. I work with Gary at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. I'm our Director of Client Engagement. Basically, what that means is I send out things like our monthly newsletter, reminders about webinars, manage our social media, and assist with things like blogs and video production, things of that nature. I'll be answering any questions that you guys have in the chat as you get going. And then we'll be stopping for questions and answers at the end after Gary's presentation. But of course, feel free to ask any questions throughout in that chat function, or we also have the Q&A function. I'll be checking both of those periodically. Gary, looks like you're back on. I can see you and hear you.
Yep, okay, good. Ready
Does
for me
it
to
say it's
screen share?
your connection's okay? Yeah, absolutely. So Gary is going to take it away, everyone. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Nick. Let me get my screen shared. Let me get that going. Now let me just get the presentation up and I'll say hello to everyone. Okay, Nick, thank you for the introduction. Welcome everybody. I'm excited to share with you some stuff about the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. And Nick, since you've done kind of the groundwork and the housekeeping, I'm gonna go ahead and jump right in. And so I'm gonna go pretty quickly here. You know, post your questions down in the chat and Nick will answer some of the questions. I'll leave time at the end for Q&A. So let me just get going and dive right in here. First of all, who are we? We're the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. Our focus is entrepreneurial mindset education. And we have professional development programs, a training certification, and entrepreneurial mindset courseware. We serve academic institutions, corporate clients, governments, nonprofit organizations around the world. That's who we are. That's what we do. So I'm going to get started and tell you a little story about where the Ice House came from. If any of you hadn't heard this story, I thought I would start with this. Since the early 90s, I've been trying to figure out like what makes entrepreneurs tick. And my thinking was if I could somehow deconstruct the underlying logic that drove entrepreneurial behavior, that this could be useful to people. That I recognized very early on that there's more to entrepreneurship than writing a business plan and doing like market research. And I also recognize that it's not really a trait-based thing. My hunch was that there's an underlying logic. There's a framework underneath the behavior. And if I could somehow, I guess I would say, decode that logic, my assumption was that this could be useful to other people and not just useful to aspiring entrepreneurs, that it could be useful to people, you know, in many, many different ways. So I began reading entrepreneurial biographies, and then I began talking to my friends whose parents were entrepreneurial or my friends that were entrepreneurs. And in 2008, I did a research project for the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute, and they gave me this platform. It was a phenomenal opportunity to interview hundreds of entrepreneurs. Well, the first thing I did for Cisco, which was interesting, which was to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in the United States. And very quickly, we saw that the way entrepreneurship is commonly characterized in the classroom is very much distinct from the way, from the day-to-day behavior and attitudes of the typical entrepreneur. So, you know, there was clearly you know, the way it was being characterized in the classroom was really, really different from what the entrepreneurs were actually doing. And so Cisco gave me this platform to go out and start interviewing hundreds of entrepreneurs on film, sort of an ethnographic research-based approach to interviewing all these entrepreneurs. I wasn't really interested in the Mark Zuckerbergs or the Elon Musks of this world. I was interested in the underdogs. I wanted to know how people who had particular advantage in life, managed to alter their place in the socioeconomic structure by being entrepreneurial. Those were the examples I was looking for, right? So, you know, I got to go all over the United States with a film crew, interviewing hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs. There was one that really stood out, excuse me, tripping over my words today. I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I met this guy by accident, Clifton Talbert. I went to Tulsa to interview a different entrepreneur who had an amazing story in his own right. And on a few hours' notice, I was introduced to Clifton Talbert. He graciously agreed to do the interview. I knew nothing about him other than he was one of the founders of the Stairmaster exercise company. And when I asked him how he learned how to think like an entrepreneur, like what influenced him, he pulled out a photograph and showed me a picture of his Uncle Cleve. And that's his original photograph on the cover of our book. And he said, you know, Clifton explained to me that he was born in this very poor cotton community in the Mississippi Delta in the 1940s. He was born to a teenage mother, you know, cotton fields and miles in every direction. He said that was the expected way of life for people that looked like me. Since I was a little kid, I was in the fields picking cotton, except for the fact that when I was 13, my Uncle Cleve, who owned the local Ice House, asked me to work alongside him at the Ice House. And it was this man, Uncle Cleve, that taught me how to think like an entrepreneur. And as Clifton began to explain what he was learning from his Uncle Cleve, I became enamored with the story. And as he described his uncle as a man with very modest education, 4th, 5th grade education, yet he was always learning, right? He was the only one in his community that put money in the bank. They weren't allowed in the bank. They had to go in the back door. But he just behaved differently. And Clifton, having the opportunity to work alongside him, got to learn how to think like an entrepreneur. So a year or so after that interview, I stayed connected to Cliff and we became friends. We wound up co-authoring the book, Who Owns the Ice House? I want to draw your attention to the subtitle because that's the basis of the Ice House program, the 8 life lessons from an unlikely entrepreneur. This is really 8 core concepts distilled from hundreds of interviews told through the lens of Cliff Talbert as a young man in the Mississippi Delta, a boy, I should say, and subsequently a young man. So that's kind of the backstory. With some initial funding from the Kauffman Foundation, we launched the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program, and you know it's gone all over the world. I'll talk a little bit about that. Just wanted to give you the kind of the backstory, which kind of tells you, I wanted to tell you that story so you understood my intention, that I wasn't really looking at this from a purely business perspective. I was trying to sort of decipher what I would describe as a behavioral phenomenon. And my intention was that this could figure this out, this could be useful in some way to others. So what I want to cover in this webinar are 3 basic things. I want to talk about the philosophy and the research behind the program. As I was interviewing entrepreneurs, hundreds of them, now I've interviewed them all over the world, in Latin America, North America, South Africa, Eastern Europe, UK, all over the world, just, you know, hundreds of entrepreneurs. I started to notice patterns, and that's kind of the 8 life lessons evolved from that, but common patterns in their logic and their language and their circumstances and their beliefs, their behaviors. And slowly but surely over time, I started to look into the behavioral sciences to really understand what I was seeing. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today. Then I'm going to talk about the course features and structure, how the Ice House program is structured. And then I'll share a little bit of the impact and, you know, some really quick examples of how this has gone all over the world. So let me start with the philosophy and the research, right? Now, here we are in a post-COVID world. You don't need me to tell you this, right? But this statement that I've been saying for years now is suddenly more germane than it's ever been, right? The world has changed in ways that now require everyone to think like an entrepreneur. And so what does that mean, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we all have to start businesses per se. But I think what it means is that we all have to start shifting, start to re-examine some of our deeply held assumptions about how we create value in the world, right? That's really what it's about. The concept of job security is pretty much become, an antiquated idea. And what do we have? 40 million people unemployed right now. It's really causing us to sort of reimagine at a mindset level how we think about how we contribute as humans in an industrialized world. So the rate of change is such is also gotten to the point that none of us has the capacity to comprehend all the changes that are happening. And I'm not just talking about COVID here, I'm talking about the accelerated pace of technological advancement. Many are saying that the rate of technological advancement is now outpaced the human capacity to adapt. And I think this is what Alvin Toffler wrote about some years ago in his book, Future Shock, right? That someday we're going to get to the point where the rate of change is happening faster than we can adapt. And some would argue that we're there, and a case could be made for that. But the point is that the entrepreneurial mindset is optimally engaged. And I'm not saying that the entrepreneurs are are able to deal with everything, but I'm saying that there's an engagement in the entrepreneurial mindset. There's some really interesting observations and insights that I'd like to share with you that have been gleaned from the observations of these, what I can only call unlikely entrepreneurs or underdog entrepreneurs. And these insights, as I hope you'll see, have a much broader impact beyond the startup world. And I'm very interested in helping people start business. I don't want to negate that. But the application of this is so much bigger than just the startup community. So, I think we all understand the importance of entrepreneurial activity in our communities, in our organizations, in the society as a whole, right? We all understand that. When we look at, the role of the entrepreneur, when we look at what entrepreneurs, the function of the entrepreneur, and people are starting to write about, the scholars are starting to write about this, that the economists are saying that, the entrepreneurial person is perhaps the most important player in the modern economy. And if you ask me to, I'll cite that. There's a paper that kind of starts with that in the abstract. But, when we look at what the entrepreneur is doing, these are the folks that are not only inventing new products and services, but they're solving problems from the most minute to some of the greatest challenges of our time, right? These are people that are innovative and entrepreneurial. They don't necessarily own a business, but they're figuring out how to improve things, how to start new businesses that create jobs, that revitalize our communities. They're improving our systems, our processes. They're solving problems, and they're improving the quality of our lives, right? And so I want to bring this down to the benefit of the individual. I mean, we all can see the benefit to the communities, to society, to the organization, but the benefit to the individual is also very important to point out, that what we see in the entrepreneur is someone that is hyper engaged, right? And as many have pointed out, that entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills are the skills employers now demand. They don't call them entrepreneurial skills, they call them soft skills, or they have some other word for it, but they're the same skills. And the bottom line here is there is unlimited global demand for people who learn how to think like an entrepreneur. I mean, that's really the point. And I think what I'm trying to say without really saying it is, I think we have to sort of begin to look at, like, what is a non-entrepreneurial mindset, right? Let's just call that an employee mindset or a prevailing mindset. And at some point it might be useful to look at the deeply held assumptions and compare and contrast the differences. And I'm not saying we need one or the other, I'm saying we need both. So, and I'm not the only one saying these things, right? The World Economic Forum has published many, many pieces saying things like that entrepreneurship education is an essential, as a societal change agent, essential for developing the human capital necessary for building societies of the future, right? For those of you who are educators, there's a fantastic paper published in 2015 by the OECD called Entrepreneurship Education. This is the first paper that I found that really, starts to articulate the benefits of entrepreneurship beyond just the startup, the sheer economic benefit. They talk about increased societal resilience, and that phrase caught my attention, about the individual growth, about increased academic engagement, and about improved equality, about a path towards a more meaningful and prosperous life for people that have been locked out or left behind. So there's another idea from the World Economic Forum that I wanted to drill into here, in which they said that it's not enough to add entrepreneurship on the perimeter, that it needs to be at the core of the way education operates, right? So I'm interpreting this as like, okay, it's good you have an entrepreneurship program on your campus or in your school or in your community. I mean, that's great, but it's not enough, right? It needs to shift from the perimeter. It needs to infiltrate that the way we think about learning and working in life. We need to permeate. I would go further to say it needs to permeate the way we think about how we work, how we learn, how we live, and how we organize as a society. I think it's bigger than just education, but nevertheless. So the question is, like, how do we do that, right? You get it, like, we got to do more, we got to go beyond startup. How do we do that? It's a great idea, but this is where we're stuck. We're stuck on the perimeter because of the way we're defining entrepreneurship. And most of the entrepreneurship programs that I see are sort of modeled after this high growth entrepreneur, right? Come up with a business idea, write a business plan, do a pitch deck, win a business plan competition, win some money, and go off and launch your business. And that's great, but that really doesn't accurately reflect the mindset or the methods of the typical entrepreneur, right? Furthermore, it is not all that interesting to the vast majority of students for whom starting a business is just something they're not really interested in, right? So we've got to define it in a way that everyone can embrace. And that's what I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit today. But the problem I also have with this high growth model of entrepreneurship is that it signals the wrong message, not only about how to be entrepreneurial, but who can be entrepreneurial, right? It sort of characterizes it as the domain of the academic elite, the whiz kids at Stanford or Harvard or whatever. So I want to try to very quickly provide a sort of a definition that's broader. And I'm going to use this concept called transformations theory that I borrowed from a guy named Dr. George Land. And he uses transformation theory to describe the nature of change within any system. And what Land is saying is there are three phases, right? There's a discovery phase. There's a growth phase where you replicate what you discovered. And then there's an obsolescence or a reinvention phase where what you discovered becomes irrelevant and you fade out, or you have to reinvent yourself, right? And what Land is saying that's so important is like these three phases are unavoidable aspects of life. The discovery phase, the growth phase, and the obsolescence or the reinvention phase, right? There's no getting around it. The trick is, according to Land, to understand which phase you are in so that you know which rules to apply. The key here is that the rules in each phase are distinct. The rules for survival in phase 1 are distinct from phase 2, which are distinct from phase 3. And the textbook definition of maladaptive is the inability to adapt because we cling to rules for survival that once enabled us to survive or succeed. And yet we fail to recognize the changes in the environment and the extent to which those changes have rendered the rules irrelevant or obsolete, right? So within that framework, I like to define entrepreneurship as a discovery process, right? It's an opportunity discovery process. And that might seem simple, but if I go back to this for a second, you know, most of us go through the discovery phase that we call formal education. And, you know, we're taught how to become useful to an employer. And so, you know, we're kind of exposed to these different career tracks that prepare us to work in an established organization where we're involved in sort of routinized value creation, right? And some of us go to business school and we, you know, get an MBA and we learn how to help large established organizations like, you know, diversify or whatever. But the point is, most of us have been socialized or normalized into a column 2 world. That's the point I want to make. So entrepreneurship is an opportunity discovery process. And the point here is that not everyone wants to start a business. But I don't think there's anyone among us who doesn't want to discover an opportunity, right? So what does that look like? I made a very simple diagram here, calling this entrepreneurial discovery. It's a Venn diagram, right? And it starts with our natural interests. And you combine your natural interests with your natural abilities. What do you like to do? Where are your natural interests? What would you do if you didn't need the money? And what are you capable of becoming good at, right? I might really like, let's say, painting. I'm interested in painting. I'm just not very good at it, right? So that's not really what I want to do. Okay. But the point is, when we can match these two things, our interests and our abilities, we create an authenticity that starts to create a force, a power, right? As Naval Ravikant said, you know, we escape competition through authenticity. And I think the intersection of these two spheres represent authenticity. But then we find the overlap where our interests and abilities match up with the needs of others. And that really represents the break point. That's what we're searching for. We're searching for a way to use our interests and abilities in a way to make ourselves useful to other humans, right? And so this opportunity discovery process requires opportunity discovery skills. And I've listed them here. I won't belabor them, but these are, broadly speaking, entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. You look at these, you'll see these are the very same skills employers demand. These are the skills that thought leaders are saying, you know, in some version of this, these are what, you know, students are going to need to adapt and thrive in the 21st century. So that's a simple definition of entrepreneurship, right? It's really about opportunity discovery. And I want to talk a little bit about what a mindset is just for a minute, right? So a lot of people use the word, we throw it around a lot, don't really understand what it means. And I'm going to very quickly try to put a little structure to that. So my definition of a mindset is the underlying beliefs, assumptions, and mental models that influence our decisions largely without our awareness, right? So the underlying, right, that's the part that really needs to be emphasized. And I'll tell you how a mindset works here very briefly. So it's unconsciously acquired. Our mindset is made up of, it's largely made up of beliefs and assumptions that we acquired unconsciously, either through social influence or our own construal or our subjective interpretation of a life experience or events, right? So it's not necessarily made up of facts that we were taught, 2 and 2 is 4, but our mindset is made up of these beliefs and assumptions that we just acquired subtly over time. So as I said, they reside beneath our conscious awareness. A funny thing about the way our brain works is that our brains are inundated with data. I think it's like 11 million bits of data every second. And our brains can only produce process like 5, not 5 million, like 5 bits of data. So our brains they're always trying to reduce the cognitive load. And one of the ways our brains do that is to automate everything it possibly can. It seeks to create habits. It seeks to create mental models. It seeks to create rule structures or heuristics or rules of thumb that we can quickly reach to so that we don't have to use the cognitive load to solve problems, right? It's a really important point. Our mindset operates effortlessly without our effort. It just happens automatically. Our mindset is also subject to all manner of errors of judgment. Cognitive biases is, the proper term for that. It draws from the past to navigate the future. And that point is really tied to this third point, right? So it automates, it has all these beliefs and heuristics and mental models, a collection of them that we don't even know we have, right? And we use them to navigate our lives. And that works perfectly well when the future looks like the past. But it gets us in all kinds of trouble when the future doesn't look like the past, right? We're like operating on autopilot, and yet we're not getting the results. And the way we often react to that is we just double down and we try harder. So lastly, I think the most important thing here is that our mindset influences every aspect of our life, from our level of motivation, our cognitive abilities, our emotions, and the choices we make. And it does most of that without our conscious awareness. And I love to evoke Carl Jung here, and when he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. I mean, that really sort of says it all to me. So, having interviewed hundreds of entrepreneurs, there seems to be this what I would call this core thought, the genesis of entrepreneurial activity stems from this deeply held, mostly unconscious idea, excuse me, that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to other humans. And that by doing so, I can empower myself, right? And very few entrepreneurs can articulate that. I interviewed a blind guy that started a television company, narrative television network for blind people. And he said to me once, he said, people will give you all the love and all the money and all the fame you could ever want if you could just help them get what they want. That's the closest I've ever come to an entrepreneur actually articulating their beliefs. And again, you know, they're operating on deeply held, mostly unconscious beliefs, which sort of perpetuates the myth around entrepreneurs as somehow having these scientifically unfathomable traits. Nevertheless, this seems to be sort of the fundamental underlying belief from which all other entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills arise, right? I don't think we have time in this webinar today, but you know, at some point I would ask you to look at that and ask yourself, how is that different from the prevailing mindset, right? Because I think a lot of us come to believe that someone else is going to tell us what is useful and how to become useful. And then we're going to go be useful to an employer in a way that's already been established. It's already been determined. We don't have to figure it out. So we don't need those opportunity discovery skills, right? So I put together a list of sort of what I would call 5 constructs of an entrepreneurial mindset. And this is a super important point here to understanding the Ice House philosophy. The first is self-efficacy beliefs. And those are mostly unconscious, deeply held beliefs about our own ability to achieve our desired goals. And that's a very short version of it. Albert Bandura is the guy that's written the most about this. He's at Stanford. So self-efficacy, there's a paper, and you know, I'll try to remember to put this one with the follow-up. There's about a 2 or 3 page paper that summarizes his work on self-efficacy that's really worth reading. Like, high self-efficacy beliefs will benefit the person in all these different ways. Low self-efficacy beliefs, also known as learned helplessness, the individual will suffer in all of these ways, right? So self-efficacy is sort of the top thing here. The second idea is locus of control. This is a deeply held belief of either internal or external locus of control, where, you know, someone with an external locus of control comes to believe that fate or luck or circumstances or powerful others somehow control their life, whereas someone with an internal locus of control believes that they are the captain of their own ship, so to speak. The fixed growth mindset. Many of you are familiar with the work of Carol Dweck. People with a fixed mindset have a deeply held belief that their talent, their intelligence, their abilities are kind of fixed on the hard drive, nothing they can do about it. Those with a growth mindset believe that through deliberate practice, they can improve, they can develop talent, they can develop their intellect and their abilities. There's also an internal, external motivational factor here, and that is, you know, are you intrinsically motivated by the task itself, or are you extrinsically motivated by financial rewards or gold stars or letter grades or certificates or what have you? And, you know, the literature is quite clear on this, that people who are intrinsically motivated outperform people who are extrinsically motivated by external rewards. And lastly, there's another concept called an explanatory style, and this has to do with your sort of self-talk. And this sort of leads to whether, this determines whether or not you develop resilience or grit. Like if you're a pessimistic explanatory style, you're less likely to have grit. If you have an optimistic explanatory style, you're more likely to have the resilience to survive setbacks and failures and so on and so forth. The point here that I want to make is when you look at entrepreneurs, they tend to have a high degree of self-efficacy. They tend to have an internal locus of control. They have a growth mindset. They tend to be intrinsically motivated. It's not just money they're after. There's a purpose-driven aspect of their work that allows them to tap into that deeper level of motivation. And they tend to become highly resilient. They tend to have an optimistic explanatory style. Now, the mistake that so many of us make is when we look at experienced, successful entrepreneurs and they have all these attributes, we then tell ourselves, oh, I guess those are the attributes you need in order to be a successful entrepreneur. And that is a gross misunderstanding. The point is, the entrepreneur develops those things as the result of pursuing a compelling goal, right? So it looks like this. I mean, this is sort of an adaptation of Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi's work on flow. Some of you might be familiar with that work. So here we are. This is our current reality, right? And there's the compelling goal. And it's the pull of the compelling goal that creates this optimal engagement, right? And so you have anxiety up here, and that happens when we are challenged above our level of skill. And boredom happens when our skill exceeds the challenge. Like we become bored, disengaged, we check out, right? My point here is simple. It's the compelling goal that elicits the high degree of self-efficacy, the internal locus of control, the growth mindset, the intrinsic motivation, and the resilience. It comes from the pursuit of a compelling goal, right? So that's really what Ice House is predicated on. We're trying to shift the locus of control. Those of you who are in education understand this. When you have an intrinsically motivated student who is there because they want to learn, your job becomes much easier and much more rewarding. And so that's really what Ice House is about, to shift that locus of control, to orient the student towards a future positive orientation. And I like to use, there's a guy, he passed away, and sadly young, a researcher at Gallup, Shane Lopez. And he defined hope as the belief that the future will be better than the present, combined with the belief that I have the power to make it so. That's really the secret to Ice House. That's what it does. And I'm going to tell you now how it does that, right? So we have some basic course objectives. We want to redefine entrepreneurship in a way that everyone can embrace it, right? No one's asking, hey, I'm not a business major. Why am I taking this course? We wanted to inspire the students by using real-world examples. I'll say more about that later. We wanted it to be an experiential problem, immerse them, engage them in the entrepreneurial process, constantly focus on the mindset. Why? What's underneath the behavior? Why are you doing that? Why not? Why are we doing it this way? Why not that way, right? Starting to understand what are the underlying beliefs that are driving the behavior. We wanted to develop a program that would connect the classroom with the entrepreneurial community, the local community. Now, our book does a good job of defining entrepreneurship. It tells a great story, that very compelling story of an underdog entrepreneur. Excuse me. There are video case studies embedded in the curriculum that show examples of people who come from similar or worse circumstances who are succeeding in this domain. But when you bring local entrepreneurs into the learning experience, it really helps shift the perspective of the student. The last thing we wanted to accomplish is a facilitated delivery that did not require the instructor, if you will, to be a subject matter expert. And that turned out to be the right thing to do. And we saw in our research at Cisco that the most efficacious entrepreneurship programs relied upon, very experienced entrepreneurs to run those programs. People that had built and sold multiple companies. And you quickly realize, well, you just can't scale that, right? And that's really, and that's fine. Even if you can, that's fine in the startup world. We wanted to create a program, a tool that could empower an educator who might not even be in the business domain to successfully deliver that program. And, here we are about 8 years on, 9 years on, and we've done that very effectively. So the course is based on these 4 concepts from Albert Bandura. We're trying to help develop self-efficacy beliefs. We're trying to shift the student from a helpless to a mastery orientation in relation to their compelling goals. So according to Bandura, there are these 4, excuse me a second. There are 4 key ingredients to helping, and this is what he calls guided mastery. First of all, you need some sort of a small win, what Bandura calls an efficacy moment. You need to feel the bat hit the ball. It should come with some effort, not too much effort. Another important ingredient, you need to see people who come from similar or worse circumstances succeeding in this domain. Very important. The third ingredient, you need someone that believes in you, someone that'll challenge you, encourage you to dig deeper, jump higher, run faster. As facilitators of the program, that might initially be you, but we're encouraging the students to find their own Uncle Cleve or Aunt Cleve as an integrated part of the course. I'm going to mute for a second. I got a tickle in my throat. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. The last key ingredient, okay, there we go, is the ability to self-regulate, right? We have to be able to take control of our lives, take control of our emotions, not just give up, flip out, whenever things go wrong. We got to become self-aware. We have to realize how our mindset is creating the outcomes and sort of have that ability to self-reflect. There's 3 core components of the course. It's really, really deceptively simple. We're exposing the students to each of these 8 core concepts, which I'll go through in just a second here. We'll immerse them in real-world experiences, and we'll keep reinforcing with relatable examples. That's the basic formula. So the 8 core concepts derived from these interviews. I'm going to go through these very, very quickly. The foundation here is the compelling goal. Choose the life you want rather than allowing your circumstances to dictate. And we're asking the students straight away in the course to start a reflective exercise and start writing about the life they want to create for themselves 5 years, 10 years out. Don't think about how, why it won't work, whatever you're going to need. Don't think about the mechanics of it. Just think about what's in your heart. Let it go, write it down, right? What you see, what we observed in the entrepreneurs, it's like almost to a man or to a woman, they always start to articulate a vision, right? There's some kind of a compelling goal on the horizon they're striving to achieve. And that's the linchpin, right? We want to get the student orienting their subconscious mind towards a positive future. The second concept is the idea that problems are opportunities. And so while most of us are trying to avoid problems, the entrepreneur is looking for them. We see every problem, frustration, or unmet need as a potential opportunity. How can we do that better? How can I fix that? How can we improve that? Constantly looking for problems to solve. Excuse me, they have a bias towards action. They don't spend a lot of time writing extensive business plans. They don't spend a lot of time, in conducting in-depth market research. They tend to act on their ideas quickly. And to the uninitiated, this looks like recklessness. But what they're actually doing is micro-experimenting, right? It's an organic survival mechanism. They're trying lots of little things. And every once in a while, they find something that works. And the fourth concept that we observed is that they're always learning. Not necessarily learning in a traditional formal setting, but they're always learning, whether it be audio books or YouTube or informal networks, or learning from their experiments and their experiences. But they seem to be more curious than the average bear. So I see this as sort of the engine of the entrepreneurial mindset. Summarize it like, you got to be looking for problems to solve, you got to be trying things, and you got to be learning. Like, that's the engine. And that becomes the heuristic, the deeply held mental model. Like, we look for problems to solve it on the smallest scale. You don't have to wait for those big aha moments. Just start problem finding, problem solving, trying things, and learning. As a result, they learn how to create wealth. They learn how to invest rather than spend. And I don't mean necessarily investing in the stock market. I mean, they're less prone to spend their discretionary thought, their discretionary time and money on recreation and leisure and distractions. They're more likely to invest in their compelling goal. They're also more likely to become reliable, right? They realize that if you're solving problems for other people, that the more reliable you become, the more people tend to bring you their problems to solve, and the better off you're going to be. So they tend to build a brand around being reliable. They also tend to create these, what I would call an intentional support community. As entrepreneurs, very often the people we traditionally turn to for support don't know how to help us because we're kind of going off trail, right? Our parents don't know how to help us. Our teachers don't know how to help us. And so what we see in entrepreneurs, they create these really powerful social networks where people will reach down to try to help the younger ones up because they got that help, right? And I think it's interesting because most of us won't do that. Most of us surround ourselves with people that are, in our same sort of mindset and socioeconomic strata. It's just more comfortable. And what we see in the entrepreneur community, they'll start to surround themselves, immerse themselves in support groups where they can mingle with people that are 3, 4, 5 rungs further up the ladder, and they'll help each other in that way. Super powerful. And lastly, we see this ability to persist. And as I said earlier, that stems from the optimism of the pursuit of a compelling goal. They develop that ability to persist, the optimistic explanatory style. They persist because of the compelling nature of their goal. So we're going to also immerse a student in real-world experiences that I call entrepreneurial learning experiences. That's experiential learning, it's project-based learning, it's peer-to-peer learning, it's self-directed learning. The entrepreneurs have no idea that's what they're doing. But when you observe them in the wild, that's precisely what they're doing, right? The key here is that they're solving ill-structured problems that don't necessarily have a single correct answer. The problems are more likely to be open-ended and complex. They're real-world problems. They require collaboration. They're constantly evolving, and they're sparking interest and controversy, right? They engage questioning and inquiry, and it's like for the first time in students' lives, they're now having to sort of figure out how to separate the signal from the noise. When all their prior learning experiences are around, there's one answer, it's in a book somewhere, you have to memorize it and then regurgitate it on a test. And that's just not the kind of learning that will enable them to adapt and thrive in the 21st century. So the Ice House program uses this concept of a business model canvas, except the fact that we modified it to sort of move away from the business focus of it. And we broke it down into 3 phases of problem finding. That's where we spend more time like learning about the problem we're trying to solve. Then we move into experimentation and adaptation. And then once we have evidence that we have a viable solution, and evidence meaning like you're not just that you're excited about it, but like you have people that are paying for it or using it or validating the idea of your real users using your idea in some way that demonstrates that it's useful. And that leads to the 3rd phase, which is about advocacy. It's like that's when you start trying to implement, that's when you start advocating for the idea and helping it to grow. And then lastly, we reinforce these concepts with case studies, with relatable social models. And there are a variety of what I would call unlikely entrepreneurs embedded throughout the program. These are people that all have come from challenging backgrounds, overcoming learning disabilities, physical disabilities, coming from impoverished situations, many different challenges they faced. And this is really what flips the switch for the students. And so throughout the program, the core concepts are reinforced with these short little video vignettes of people that are talking about how they overcame their adversity by embracing these entrepreneurial ideas. So that's basically philosophy, research, features, and structure. I want to talk briefly about the impact of the program. And there are now 4 different versions of the Ice House program. We have a middle school version. We have a student success version for college and high school. We have the small business edition. And then we also have the original Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. This variety, these 4 different versions are being used in ways we could have never anticipated when we began. Since we launched in 2011 at the Kauffman Foundation, we've trained approximately 2,500 facilitators on 5 continents. Tens of thousands of students have now been enrolled in this program, from middle school to postgraduate doctoral seminars and everything in between. The program was featured on NPR, it's been featured on CNN Money, USA Today, the Huffington Post. Here's an example from a deployment in Erie, Pennsylvania, where they put about 800, they started with an 800 student pilot of middle schoolers. These were 7th grade kids. And I was completely blown away. If you want to learn more about that, if you Google search Ice House Erie video, you'll see this video come up. But the impact on these kids when they were allowed to start solving problems that they saw in their classroom, in their communities, the level of engagement was nothing short of astonishing. They've now expanded that throughout the school system. I'd be happy to connect you if you're interested with with the superintendents and so forth that are leading that initiative in Erie. Another high school implementation, this was a big one, and Prepa Tech is a private high school system in Mexico where they put 7,500 students through the Ice House program, about 15,000 now, excuse me, through the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program with unbelievable outcomes. Again, just very high scores, very high levels of engagement. The Student Success Program, a blind study at Pikes Peak Community College, 1,000 students randomly put in Ice House program, created a 28% positive impact on their persistence. So in community colleges, about half the kids that show up in the fall aren't there in the spring semester. About half drop out. The Ice House program bumped that by 28%. And Lance Bolton said to me that, that he thought it was a 2.8%, which he said he would have been happy with. He thought they just forgot the decimal point. And he was delighted, you know, to find out it was a 28% impact on student persistence. Now, through a generous grant from the Kauffman Foundation, we've trained teachers across the West Virginia Community Career and Technical College system in West Virginia. We've trained, I've lost track of how many, I think 100 facilitators throughout that system where the program is being used in a variety of ways. Some of you may have heard me talk about one of the ways it's being used in city government in Albuquerque. It's being used, they're in the process of putting 6,000 city government workers through the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program, thanks to Tom Darling, who was an instructor at Central New Mexico Community College. So those are just some brief examples. We've recently partnered with NCIDEA, the NCIDEA Foundation in the Durham, North Carolina, Raleigh-Durham area. And this is led by Tom Rue, formerly of the Kauffman Foundation. That's Tom right here. I'm kind of in the upper left-hand corner. Tom was the vice president of entrepreneurship at Kauffman Foundation. That was our champion that helped bring Ice House to life at the Kauffman Foundation. He's since left Kauffman. He's now running this foundation in North Carolina where they're committed to putting 100,000 North Carolinians through the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. We're in the midst of our, I think our 4th cohort, or is our 5th cohort, I've forgotten now, it's crazy. We've trained almost 200 educators across North Carolina, from nonprofit to middle school, high school, community college, 4-year universities. That's happening right now. We're in the middle of I think, our 5th cohort right now. So I'm going to stop talking. It was a lot of talking, went a little bit longer than I anticipated. If you want to learn more, you can start. An easy way to engage with us is you can buy the book. We just released it in Audible. There's a phenomenal, the voice actors just did a phenomenal job. So it's available at Kindle, Audible, softcover, hardcover. It's also available in Spanish language on Kindle if you're interested. We also have a self-paced version of the course. We lowered the price to $99. It's available on our website. If you want to just take the course yourself, you can dig in right now. It's really a treasure trove of ideas that'll definitely help shift your thinking about what it means to be innovative and entrepreneurial. Lastly, if you want to learn how to become an Eli certified Ice House facilitator, our next public online facilitator training is happening July 1st through 22nd. It looks like this will also sell out, as did the previous online facilitator training. This training will not only equip you to and certify you to teach the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. A lot of folks are just using it for professional development. It's helping them bring these ideas back to their organizations, to develop entrepreneurial leadership, entrepreneurial faculty, to create entrepreneurial culture in their organizations. So I'm going to just end with this last comment that really sums it all up for me. It's very simple. We don't have to bulldoze the buildings. We don't have to start over. I think we have to stop asking students what they want to be when they grow up. We have to start asking them what problems they want to solve and what they need to learn in order to solve those problems. I think that's the fundamental shift that helps to re-engage the student in a powerful way. So I'm going to pause for a second and we'll just take questions from here. And Nick, I'll let you lead in that endeavor.
Sure. The first question is from Carolyn King, Richmond, and she just wished for you to repeat the insight that you received from the blind gentleman who created.
Oh yeah. His name is Jim Stovall, and I think we put that clip up on YouTube. If you Google search the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, Jim Stovall, I think the quote is there, the little snippet from my interview with him. Nevertheless, he said something to the effect of, people will give you all the love, all the money, and all the fame you could ever ask for if you just help them get what they want.
Perfect. Nothing quite yet, but any and all questions are definitely available. Just a quick affirmation that fixing problems is what makes you money, kind of reaffirming your point, Gary, that solving problems for others is what creates real value for the world. It can't start with money as the goal.
That's the thing. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you to the listener who brought that up, because you know, we all think like, well, I got to make money, and like, what does that really mean? I have to make money. And I think we just need to reconfigure that phrase to say, I got to create value. And it's really simple. The essence of the entrepreneurial mindset is so deceptively simple. It's just different than the way we've been taught to think. We're so inured to the fact that someone else is going to tell us how to be useful. And they're going to tell us what to do, and we're going to do it, and then they're going to pay us for it, right? And so we forget, like, stop thinking about how to make money and start thinking about how to make yourself useful. And if you're useful, the money will come. And I'm a huge fan of the work of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, and some of his other writings. But he once said something to the effect of, like, it's like happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. And I think the same thing can be said for money. Like, when we just pursue money, it's elusive, and as is the happiness that we think we're going to get from the money. But the money ensues, and the idea from the Ice House is, like, just figure out how to make yourself useful to other humans. You don't need to be a genius to do that. You don't need to have a Stanford MBA. You don't need venture capital. You don't need a big idea. You don't need to quit your job. You don't need to drop out of school. Just reorient your mind towards figuring out, what do other people need? What can I bring to other people? I'll tell you something I've been saying in my keynotes and workshops and lectures to some folks, I say this to students, like, or anyone for that matter, but, you know, start thinking about a side hustle, right? Figure out how to earn $10,000 and put it in a separate bank account so it doesn't just disappear in your lifestyle. Like, this is just a project as a way to reorient your mind so that you start investing your discretionary thought and time and resources, figuring out how to make yourself useful. And if you do that, that will change you forever. It will change the way you think about yourself and how you fit into the world. It will transform you into a lifelong learner. It will make you a vastly more engaged student, right? It'll make you a better worker. It'll change you profoundly in so many different ways. So thank you for bringing that up. I'll try not to go off on rants like this, but those of you who know me know I'm prone to do these things.
Sure. A quick question, just something I'm happy to voice now for anyone else who's thinking about it. And I forgot to mention at the start of this, we will be sending a recording of this along with a follow-up email that'll include the slides and a couple links to things that Gary mentioned throughout the talk, including some resources on our website. So no worries there. If you have any more specific questions on kind of the process of becoming certified, what the course looks like, things like that, I would also just ask you to email me. My email is nic@elimindset.com. I'll put that in the chat for everyone. That way I can just get you as much information as you need. But we also have a direct question. We have two. One from Sunil. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Do you, Gary, genuinely believe, can entrepreneurs be totally created with problem solving, resilience, et cetera, et cetera? I'll interpret that as kind of the, are they born with it or can you make them question?
Yeah, that's an interesting question that I'm often asked, and I'm going to flip it inside out on you here. What I've come to believe is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. And so think of it like this. Like, humans are just like every other mammal. We're all born with both the desire and the capacity to learn everything we need to learn in order to adapt and thrive in our environment. Right? Like, let's just start with that. We're all born curious, creative, right? We all have an innate desire to become all that we can become, just like any other living thing, right? When you see a little plant trying to sprout up in the asphalt, that's what Carl Rogers called like the master motivator. Like, that's in all of us, right? But then what you're introducing is like this idea of learned helplessness, right? So when we see people who appear to be lazy, the vast majority of the time, that's not laziness, that's learned helplessness. Those are people who have come to believe that they don't have control over their lives. So, when people say are entrepreneurs made or born, I'm saying they're born, but I'm not saying they're born like they're rare. They just happen to have these traits. And by the way, this is not just my opinion. I've looked at the psychological literature. Like hereditary traits don't even come close to adequately explaining, the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. I think through socialization and formal education, we all learn not to be innovative and entrepreneurial. We learn how to follow rules. We learn how to obey the boss. We learn to pay attention and do what other people tell us to do. We learn to memorize facts and follow the rules. And in that way, non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned.
Great, great. Two more questions that I see in front of me. I'll answer one that I can answer myself. Bara wants to know about the cost of the training program. Facilitator training starts for the online version that Gary mentioned, coming up in July, starts at $995. If you want to learn more about what that includes, again, feel free to email me. I put my email in the chat just a second ago. Gary, here's a good one for you from Vertel. How do you reconcile the entrepreneurial mindset with Maslow's hierarchy of human needs? If one cannot get past the lower level of safety and security needs, how will he or she be able to move to the upper levels of the hierarchy, e.g. self-esteem, problem solving beyond egoism, etc.?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm not, I forgive me if I'm framing this as a panacea. And I mean, people have come to us before and said like, well, I want to use this program for people that are in a homeless shelter or whatever. And I forgive me if I'm making those claims, but I'm not. I don't mean to say that, this can, solve anyone's ills. I mean, to your point, we generally need to get our basic needs met. Food, clothing, shelter, the safety, the security, these basic things before we can start to think about, how to, it's kind of Maslow answers the questions for us, really. The basic needs need to be met first.
Which is, just to add on to that, a big part of why, Gary, you often say, don't quit your day job when you're starting these things, because your day job is what's helping you maintain those kind of base of the pyramid in the Maslow pyramid needs. And if you're not there, that's something that your community can maybe help you with along the way.
Yeah. Now, with all that being said, Ice House is being used with enormous success in the realm of reentry programs, right? Even pre-release or post-release, like the program is being used very effectively there. So again, I think some basic needs have to be met. But in some ways, the entrepreneurial mindset can help us figure out how to get our basic needs met.
And reorient.
I don't see it as an either. Yeah, I don't necessarily see it as an either or situation. I think of it like this, like rather than trying to lay it over Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I would prefer to think of it like all of us humans are somewhere on a spectrum of a helpless to a mastery orientation, right? So let's say if you got a homeless person, that's pretty, low on the efficacy, that's a helpless orientation. And you could have like a Richard Branson type, like has a mastery orientation. We're all somewhere on that spectrum. And what Ice House is designed to do is meet the person where they are and move that needle a couple notches up towards mastery away from helplessness. I think that's just a better way to think about it.
Absolutely. Any other last questions before we end this? And if you do have anything else that you don't get in, no problem. Again, you can always feel free to email me. I'll be sending that follow-up email either this afternoon or tomorrow, depending on how long it takes for the video to upload. But
yeah. And Nick, I'll remember to send you that paper about the self-efficacy, the Bandura paper. You can put that in there. I'll do that as soon as we get off the call. That's a really interesting piece I'd like to share with you all. I'd also like to mention that in addition to the book, the course, the facilitator training, that we also do workshops, both virtually and in person, like faculty development workshops, professional development workshops, one-day type workshops that we're doing a lot of for academic institutions, higher ed institutions, to sort of help create an entrepreneurial culture within their organization. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Absolutely. All right, I think that wraps it up, mostly just getting thank yous. Thank you everybody for attending, and stay safe out there.
Yeah. Thanks everybody. Thanks for joining. Thanks for spending your precious time with us. Anything we can do to help. If you have any follow-up questions, by all means, hit us up. Happy to help.